Welcome everyone to this explainer. Today we're unpacking a really fascinating and frankly, highly controversial analysis by political commentator Topher Field. We're going to be digging into a very specific mechanism, one that explains exactly how political influence translates directly into private profit. It's one of those concepts that kind of makes you reevaluate how the gears of government and private enterprise lock together. The way this pathway is constructed is incredibly methodical, and seeing the timeline laid out, it really brings the whole picture into focus. Okay, let's dive right into this.
The entire source material is anchored by this one brilliant, honestly jarring observation from Field. Corruption in Australia comes with all the receipts. Now, we often have this very movie-like idea of political corruption, right? Bags of cash handed over in dark alleyways or secret offshore bank accounts. But Field asserts that the most expensive, profound conflicts of interest, they don't look like that at all. Instead, they happen completely legally, entirely above board, complete with press announcements, proper tendering processes, and perfectly filed paperwork. It's a wildly provocative starting point, suggesting that the real issue isn't about breaking the rules. It's about who actually gets to write the rules in the first place.
To really understand how this works, we have to define what the source calls the public-to-private pathway. And remember, this is a perfectly legal trajectory. Basically, it happens when a public official uses their time in office to create specific funding pools and regulatory frameworks. Then, after leaving public office, that same individual transitions into the private sector and directly profits from the exact structures they just built. To illustrate this phenomenon, the source uses former Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull as its primary, detailed case study. The argument here is that Turnbull's career provides an absolute textbook example of this pathway in action. To build this case, the source takes us on a chronological deep dive, starting with this concept of building the rails. Think of it like laying down the tracks for a very specific, very lucrative train to arrive years later. Field argues that during his tenure as Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull didn't just generally support renewable energy. No, he systematically constructed a massive, taxpayer-funded infrastructure that was heavily geared towards certain types of projects. He effectively built the rails that a future private enterprise could smoothly roll right along, making sure the government was locked in to fund a specific sector for decades to come. Just watch how quickly this builds in rapid succession. According to the video, Turnbull first maneuvered within his party to save the $10 billion Clean Energy Finance Corporation from the chopping block. Then, shortly after taking the top job, he launched a brand new $1 billion Clean Energy Innovation Fund with a very specific focus on energy storage. Next up, he expanded the mandate of ARENA, that's the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, specifically to include pumped hydro projects. And finally, under his government, massive funding flowed to the Australian National University to create a comprehensive atlas, basically mapping out all the ideal locations for pumped hydro across the entire country. So the crucial point here is the sheer scale of the frameworks being established, funded entirely by taxpayer money. We are talking about $10 billion protected in one fund, another billion created in a new fund, and massive annual federal funding going toward university research that specifically identifies lucrative sites. And it didn't stop at the federal level. This momentum directly inspired state-level action, with the new South Wales government initiating a pumped hydro tender process to literally sell off access to those very locations. Field connects all these massive taxpayer sums to make a bold claim that a guaranteed, highly lucrative market for pumped hydro was artificially legislated into existence. To really highlight how lucrative government infrastructure can be, the source points straight to Turnbull's signature project while in office, Snowy 2.0. The original pitch for this massive pumped hydro project, $2 billion. But today, official government estimates concede it will cost over $12 billion. And independent analysis suggests the total cost to the system could balloon to an absolutely staggering $42 billion. Now, why does the source bring this up? Because, as Field argues, in the world of government-funded frameworks, a cost blowout isn't seen as a failure. Actually, it's seen as a feature. It represents a massively expanding opportunity for future consultants, advisors, and private firms to tap into the taxpayer purse. Okay, now for the major pivot from public policy to private enterprise. Let's fast forward a bit to January 2023. Malcolm Turnbull has been out of Parliament for just over 4 years. And what does he do? He registers a private company, Turnbull Renewables. According to the source, this is exactly where the public-to-private pathway completes its circuit.
The analysis leans heavily into the irony of this moment, highlighting just how seamlessly the former prime minister steps perfectly into the exact industry, and specifically the exact pumped hydro niche that he just spent years funding, protecting, and researching with billions of taxpayer dollars. And this brilliantly illustrates what we could call the Turnbull Renewables playbook. It plays out as this strategic, flowing sequence of events. First, the company successfully wins those New South Wales government tenders for pumped hydro sites in the Hunter Valley. The tenders made possible by the very policies we just talked about. Then, while still in the concept design phase, they turn around and sell the project off to the massive energy corporation AGL. But here is the real kicker. Turnbull Renewables retains a paid advisory role on the project to help AGL lobby the government for the financial support and slush funds that Turnbull himself created when he was prime minister. It's basically a perfect loop. But listen to this, because the strategy gets even more specific. The source notes that in his new private capacity, Turnbull is actively lobbying the government's capacity investment scheme. But he isn't just asking for general funding. He is specifically lobbying to establish a strict minimum storage duration requirement of exactly 8 hours for energy projects to even qualify for this special tender process. This seemingly arbitrary 8-hour cutoff, it is incredibly strategic. It effectively rules out almost every type of standard lithium battery on the market because they drain much faster. So it leaves pumped hydro, which uses massive reservoirs of water and gravity to store energy over long periods, as one of the only viable beneficiaries of the funding. Which brings us to a highly revealing detail. Why push so hard to eliminate projects under 8 hours? Well, both of the Hunter Valley pumped hydro projects that Turnbull Renewables sold to AGL and is currently advising on sit perfectly at a 10-hour storage duration. Quite the coincidence, right? They clear that proposed 8-hour hurdle with just enough room to spare. The video essay presents this as a perfectly tailored policy recommendation that just so happens to ideally suit the exact private projects the former prime minister is now profiting from. At this point, the source zooms out to make a much broader argument. It asserts that this phenomenon is absolutely not an isolated incident, and it's certainly not a single-party issue. To prove this, Field compares Malcolm Turnbull of the centre-right Liberal Party with Daniel Andrews, the former Premier of Victoria, from the centre-left Labour Party. The source points out that Andrews similarly left office and swiftly moved to profit in the private sector, from relationships he built with China while travelling on the taxpayer's dime. So the takeaway here is a systemic, bipartisan culture among politicians of using public office to essentially feather their own nests for their post-political careers. And all of this brings us to the core question the source really wants us to wrestle with. Think about it. Even if every single step of this process is entirely legal, even if all the receipts are perfectly filed, the source asks, is this the standard we are willing to accept from the people we entrust with power? It's a genuinely provocative thought that highlights the incredibly fine line between legal public policy and private opportunism. It forces us to ask whether our political incentives are fundamentally broken and what it might actually take to change a culture where public service so reliably paves the way for private wealth. Thanks for joining me for this explainer. I hope it brought this complex pathway into clear focus for you.